The wind, a cruel and lonely thing, whispered through the high pines of the Montana Territory, carrying with it the scent of snow and the taste of despair. It was a lament for the dying light, for the last streaks of crimson and bruised purple that clung to the jagged teeth of the western mountains. Down below, in a clearing scarred by a long-dead fire, a woman was chained to the heart of an ancient oak. The iron cuff was a cold, unforgiving bite against the delicate skin of her wrist, its chain a serpent of rust and malice that looped around the tree's immense trunk. Her name was Eliza, and she had once known the softness of linen sheets and the weight of leather-bound books. Now, she knew only the rough bark against her back, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, and the chilling certainty that the coming night would be her last. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, was torn and stained with mud and fear. Her hair, the color of autumn honey, was a tangled mat of leaves and twigs. She was a portrait of ruin, a testament to the casual cruelty of a powerful man. Her crime had not been theft nor murder, but the simple, defiant act of saying no. She had refused Bartholomew Thorne, a man who saw the world as his personal property, and for that, he had decided to break her. He had taken her reputation, then her freedom, and now, he had left her for the wolves and the cold, chained like an animal he had grown tired of. A tear, hot and sharp, froze on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of rage. A tiny, flickering ember in the vast, encroaching ice of her fate. She would not die whimpering. She would not give him that satisfaction. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in a final, defiant memory of the sun's warmth on her face. Have you ever felt a chain around your soul? Not one of iron, but of circumstance, of fear, of a past that refuses to let you go. This is a story about those chains, the visible and the invisible. It is the story of a woman left to perish and the broken man who found her. It is a testament to the truth that sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are not found on a battlefield, but in the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the light within you be extinguished. It's a story about how kindness, offered without expectation, can become the key that sets two prisoners free. Silas moved through the forest with the quiet competence of a man who was more a part of it than a visitor. The woods were his sanctuary and his prison, a place he had retreated to after the world of men had taken everything from him. The war had stolen his youth, and the fever that followed had stolen his wife and son, leaving him a hollowed-out vessel haunted by the ghosts of laughter and love. He now lived a solitary life in a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, his only companions the whisper of the wind and the steady, silent judgment of the mountains. He was checking his trap lines, a grim necessity for the coming winter, when he felt it. A subtle wrongness in the air, a discord in the forest's ancient rhythm. His hand went instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt. He followed the feeling, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet of pine needles, until he stepped into the clearing. He saw her then, and the world seemed to stop. For a moment, he thought she was a spirit, a wood nymph from the old stories, bound to the tree by some forgotten magic. But then he saw the raw, chafed skin of her wrist, the glint of real iron, and the very human shudder that ran through her thin frame. His heart, a thing he thought had long since turned to stone, gave a painful lurch. He had seen the depths of human cruelty in the war, but this was different. This was a personal, intimate kind of evil. He stepped forward, and her eyes snapped open. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a terror so profound it silenced the air between them. He stopped, holding his hands up slowly, showing they were empty. He was a large man, bearded and weathered by the elements, and he knew he looked like the very thing she should fear. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. She flinched at the sound but didn't look away. Her chin was lifted in a gesture of defiance that her trembling body betrayed. "Who did this?" he asked, the question more a curse than an inquiry. She remained silent, her jaw tight. Trust was a luxury she no longer possessed. Silas didn't press. Words were useless here. He knelt, examining the heavy lock on the cuff. It was crudely made but strong. He looked from the lock to her face, seeing the flicker of hope warring with a lifetime of fresh betrayal. He made a decision. He was a man who had sworn off the world, who had asked only to be left alone with his grief. But leaving her here was not an option. It would be a betrayal of the man he once was, the man his wife had loved. He stood. "Stay here," he commanded, the words softer than he intended. He turned and walked back into the woods, his long strides purposeful. The woman, Eliza, watched him go, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. He was leaving. Of course, he was leaving. Why would anyone help her? But moments later, he returned, carrying a heavy woodsman's axe. He didn't approach her, but the chain. He wedged the axe head between the chain and the tree, and with a powerful grunt, he struck the back of the axe with a large rock. The sound of metal striking metal was a shriek in the quiet woods. He struck it again and again, his movements economical and powerful. Finally, with a sharp crack, a link in the chain snapped. She was free from the tree, but the cuff was still on her wrist, the broken length of chain dangling from it like a dead snake. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "Can you walk?" She tried to stand, but her legs, cramped and cold, buckled beneath her. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. She was light as a fistful of dry leaves. She stiffened, a gasp escaping her lips, but she was too weak to fight. As he carried her away from the oak that had been her prison, she looked back at it, a dark monument to her suffering. The man holding her said nothing, his face a mask of grim determination as he walked toward the distant pillar of smoke that marked his home, a place he never thought he would share again. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was built with the sturdiness of a fortress and the care of a prayer. Every log was perfectly notched, every stone in the hearth precisely placed. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and a deep, abiding solitude. Silas laid Eliza gently on the simple cot in the corner, which was covered with a thick bear pelt. The warmth of the room was a shock to her system, a kindness so foreign it felt like an assault. She watched him with wide, wary eyes as he moved about the space. He stirred the embers in the fireplace, adding a fresh log until a cheerful blaze pushed back the room's shadows. He ladled stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl, the aroma of meat and root vegetables making her stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was painful. He placed the bowl on a small crate beside the cot, along with a tin cup of water and a spoon. He did all of this without a single word, his movements deliberate and contained, as if he were afraid any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile truce between them. He retreated to the far side of the room, sitting in a rough-hewn chair by the fire, his back partially to her, granting her the illusion of privacy. Eliza stared at the stew. Could be poisoned. This man could be another monster, one with a different, more patient method. But the hunger was a primal force, overriding the fear. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon. The first bite was agony and ecstasy. She ate slowly at first, then with a ravenous desperation, not stopping until the bowl was clean. She drank the water, the cool liquid a balm to her raw throat. Only when she was finished did she look at him again. He hadn't moved. He was staring into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light, a landscape of sorrow and strength. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He didn't turn. "No one deserves that," he said, his voice low and final. It was not the whole truth, but it was the only part he was willing to share. He saw in her the same brand of suffering he carried in himself, a wound inflicted by the world's casual cruelty. Helping her felt less like a choice and more like a duty to the ghosts that haunted him. He rose and came back to the cot, this time with a small metal file and a bottle of oil. He gestured to the iron cuff. "This needs to come off." She flinched, pulling her arm back. "I won't hurt you," he repeated, his gaze steady. He saw the terror in her eyes, the reflexive certainty that any touch was a threat. He waited, his patience a silent promise. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her arm. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he worked the oil into the lock and began to file away at the pin. He worked in silence for what felt like an hour, the rhythmic scrape of the file the only sound besides the crackling fire. Eliza watched his bent head, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. This close, she could see the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the silver threads in his dark hair. He was a man who had known profound loss. She could feel it, a resonance of pain that vibrated between them. Finally, with a small click, the lock gave way. The heavy iron cuff fell open. Silas pulled it from her wrist, revealing the raw, bruised skin beneath. He tossed the metal into the fire, where it began to glow a dull, angry red, a piece of her past being consumed by the flames. He gently cleaned the wound on her wrist and wrapped it with a strip of clean linen. His task complete, he retreated back to his chair, leaving her with a freedom she hadn't felt in months. She rubbed her wrist, the absence of the weight a strange and startling sensation. She was in a stranger's cabin, a man who was both terrifying and kind, but she was no longer chained. For the first time in a very long time, a single, fragile seed of hope began to push its way through the frozen soil of her heart. The days that followed unfolded in a quiet, fragile rhythm. The world outside the cabin was a wilderness of snow and silence, but inside, a delicate ecosystem of trust was beginning to grow. Silas never pressed her for her story, never asked her name. He simply provided. Each morning, he would leave a bowl of porridge and a cup of weak tea by her bed before heading out to check his traps or chop wood. He gave her space, an invisible boundary in the small cabin that he never crossed. He seemed to understand that her fear was a wild animal that would bolt at any sudden movement. Eliza spent the first few days mostly sleeping, her body and spirit engaged in a deep and profound repair. When she was awake, she watched him. She watched the way he mended a worn saddle blanket with neat, practiced stitches. She watched the way he would pause and look out the window towards the mountains, his eyes filled with a distant, unreadable sorrow. He was a man of immense self-sufficiency, yet there was a loneliness about him so vast it seemed to have its own gravity. Slowly, she began to heal. The bruises on her soul started to fade, and the strength returned to her limbs. One morning, Silas returned from his work to find she had swept the hearth and folded the spare blanket at the foot of her cot. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning, a silent message that she was a guest, not just a patient. He simply nodded his acknowledgement, but a flicker of something new, perhaps surprise, perhaps pleasure, crossed his face before it was gone. The next day, she took it upon herself to knead the dough he had left rising by the fire and bake a small, lopsided loaf of bread. The cabin filled with a smell that hadn't been there in years, the warm, comforting scent of home. When they ate their dinner of rabbit stew that night, they shared her bread. "It's good," he said, the two words a monumental offering from such a silent man. "My mother taught me," she replied, her own voice still hesitant, a shy visitor in the quiet room. That small exchange was a turning point. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer a space of caution and fear, but one of growing comfort, of shared solitude rather than isolated loneliness. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small observations about the world outside their door. He taught her how to tell a wolf track from a coyote's, how to predict the weather by the color of the sky, how to find kindling that would burn even when damp. In return, she brought a softness back into his life. She organized his meager collection of tins and supplies, mended the tear in his winter coat, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't listening, she would hum a quiet tune, a melody from her past that was more memory than song. One afternoon, he came inside, shaking snow from his shoulders, and found her sitting by the window, a book in her hands. It was one of only 3 he owned, a tattered copy of Shakespeare. She looked up, embarrassed as if caught in a private act. "I'm sorry, It's all right," he said, his voice gentle. "It was my wife's. She loved the stories." It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. The word hung in the air between them, full of unspoken history. He looked at the book in her hands, and for a moment, the stoic mask slipped, revealing a chasm of grief so deep it stole her breath. He saw her looking, and the mask was back in place. But the wall had been breached. They were no longer just a protector and his ward. They were two people, sharing a space, each with a past too heavy to carry alone. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a crucible, and in its warmth, something new and resilient was being forged between them. A month bled into the next. The deep snows of winter locked them into their mountain sanctuary, creating a world that consisted of nothing but the cabin, the forest, and each other. The isolation, which would have driven others mad, became the fertile ground in which their connection deepened. The quiet routine of survival, chopping wood, fetching water, preparing food, became a shared language, a daily reaffirmation of their reliance on one another. Eliza's physical wounds had long since healed, but it was the transformation within her that was most profound. The haunted, fearful woman Silas had found chained to a tree was gone, replaced by a person of quiet strength and profound resilience. Her laughter, at first a rare and startling sound, became more frequent, often sparked by a clumsy mishap or a shared moment of peace. She was rediscovering the person she was before Bartholomew Thorne had tried to erase her. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the shutters and howling like a hungry beast, the warmth of the fire seemed to draw their stories out of them. It was Eliza who spoke first. She looked into the flames, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and she finally gave a name to the monster in her past. She told Silas everything. She spoke of her life as a schoolteacher in a small town in the east, of her dreams and her simple ambitions. She spoke of Bartholomew Thorne, the wealthy landowner who had courted her, refusing to take no for an answer. When his flattery failed, his possessiveness turned to menace. He used his influence to ruin her, spreading vicious lies that cost her her job and her standing in the community. Desperate and alone, she had accepted his offer of a position as a governess on his remote estate, not realizing it was a trap. He had treated her as his prisoner, and when she finally made a desperate attempt to escape, he had dragged her into the woods and chained her to that tree, telling her that if he could not own her, then the wilderness could have her. As she spoke, Silas listened with an unnerving stillness. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He was not looking at her, but into the fire, as if seeing the face of Thorne in the embers. The raw injustice of it all resonated with his own sense of a world gone wrong, a world where innocence was a liability and cruelty went unpunished. When her story was finished, a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the shriek of the wind. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, half expecting judgment or pity. Instead, she saw a shared pain. "He will not find you here," Silas said, and it was not a reassurance, but a vow. The firelight flickered across his face, and in that moment, he felt his own past rise up to meet hers. "The war taught me what men are capable of," he began, his voice a low, gravelly thing, pulled from a place of deep pain. "But it wasn't the fighting that broke me." He told her of Sarah, his wife, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes, and of his son, Thomas, a boy with his mother's eyes. He had been away fighting for a cause he barely believed in when the fever came. He had returned a hero to a home that was nothing but a grave. "I came up here," he said, his gaze sweeping the sturdy cabin walls, "to get away from a world that didn't make sense anymore, a world that takes the good and leaves the wicked to prosper." Eliza reached out, her hand resting for a moment on his arm. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, but for Silas, it was like a lightning strike. It had been years since he had felt the willing, gentle touch of another person. The barrier he had so carefully constructed around his heart fractured. In that small room, with the storm raging outside, two broken souls laid their scars bare, and in doing so, created a bond stronger than any chain and a sanctuary more powerful than any fortress. The blizzard broke, leaving the world encased in a pristine, silent blanket of white. Felt like a cleansing, a new beginning. In the aftermath of their shared confessions, the dynamic in the cabin shifted once more. The last vestiges of fear and formality evaporated. replaced by a comfortable, unspoken intimacy. They moved around each other with an easy grace, their daily tasks a silent dance of partnership. Eliza no longer felt like a refugee, but a resident. She took Silas's worn, threadbare shirts and mended them with a skill that brought them back to life. She discovered a small sack of forgotten seeds and, with a hopeful heart, started them in small pots on the windowsill, promising a garden come spring. She was not just surviving anymore. She was building. She was putting down roots in the unlikeliest of soil. Silas, for his part, was a man slowly returning from the dead. The deep lines of grief around his eyes began to soften. A ghost of a smile would sometimes touch his lips when he watched her humming by the fire or when she proudly presented a perfectly baked loaf of bread. He had built this cabin as a tomb for his heart, a place to live out his days in silent penance. But Eliza's presence had filled it with light and warmth, chasing away the long shadows of his past. He found himself making things for her, a small, smoothly carved stool so she could sit more comfortably by the hearth, a second shelf by her cot for the books and the pots of burgeoning seedlings. Each object was a silent declaration, a piece of himself offered up in the language he knew best, the work of his hands. Their romance was not one of flowery words or grand gestures. It was a thing of quiet moments and deep, unspoken understanding. It was in the way he would place an extra log on the fire when he noticed her shivering. It was in the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. It was in a shared look across the dinner table that said more than 1,000 words. One afternoon, while she was hanging their washed clothes on a line near the cabin, her hand brushed against his as they both reached for the same clothespin. A jolt, warm and electric, passed between them. They both froze, their eyes meeting. In his gaze, she saw not just protection, but a raw, vulnerable affection that mirrored her own. In her eyes, he saw not a victim to be pitied, but a strong, beautiful woman who saw the man he was, not just the hermit he had become. The moment stretched, fragile and perfect, in the cold, clean air. He slowly raised his hand and gently brushed a stray strand of honey-colored hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers were unbelievably soft against her skin. It was a touch that held a universe of longing, respect, and a question he didn't dare voice. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat, a silent answer. They were no longer just two survivors. They were a man and a woman, standing on the precipice of a future they had never dared to imagine. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, in a cabin built for one, they were becoming a family. The thaw came, first as a trickle, then a flood. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath, and the world was reborn in the vibrant green of spring. With the changing season came a renewed sense of hope. Eliza's garden began to thrive, its neat rows a testament to her faith in the future. Silas began clearing a new patch of land, his axe swinging with a purpose that had been absent for years. They spoke of the future in quiet, hopeful tones, of planting a small orchard, of getting a milk cow, perhaps even a few chickens. The life they were building felt real, solid, and safe. But the past is a patient hunter, and their sanctuary was not as impenetrable as they had believed. The first sign of trouble came with a man named Jed, an old trapper who made a yearly trip into the high country. He stumbled upon Silas's cabin by chance, his eyes wide with surprise to see a woman's touch about the place. He was a decent man, and after sharing a meal, he prepared to leave. As he mounted his horse, he offered a piece of news with the casual air of someone delivering gossip. "Best be careful down in the valley," he said, pulling on his gloves. "That rich fella, Thorne, has gone half mad. Still looking for that governess who run off on him. Offering a reward that'd make a king jealous. Got posters up from here to Helena. Says she's a thief and his property. He's got men scouring every homestead and settlement." Jed rode off, oblivious to the bomb he had just detonated in their peaceful world. The air grew thick and cold. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain breeze. Thorne's name was a poison, turning their vibrant paradise into a cage. She looked at Silas, her face pale, the old fear returning to her eyes. "He'll find me," she whispered. the words a death knell to their fragile dreams. Silas's face was like granite. He stepped closer to her, his presence a solid wall against the encroaching dread. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He will not." In that moment, the quiet homesteader vanished, and the soldier he had once been returned. His eyes were cold and sharp, scanning the tree line, assessing sight lines and defensive positions. The peace of the last few months had been a temporary ceasefire, not a permanent treaty. The war had followed him up the mountain, and this time he had something to fight for that he was not willing to lose. Over the next few days, the cabin transformed from a home into a fortification. Silas worked with a grim, silent efficiency. He reinforced the door, barred the single window with a heavy shutter, and cleared the brush away from the cabin to create an open field of fire. He brought out his old army rifle, cleaning and oiling it with a practiced hand. He showed Eliza how to load it, his hands guiding hers, the lesson a grim necessity. She was terrified, but she did not shrink from it. The woman Thorn was hunting for was not the same woman who now stood beside Silas. She had found her strength here, in this small patch of earth, and she would not surrender it, or the man who had helped her find it, without a fight. The idyllic quiet was replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were no longer just building a future. They were preparing to defend it with their lives. The day arrived as all days do, with the sun rising over the eastern peaks, indifferent to the dramas of men. It was a hawk's cry, sharp and unnatural, that served as the first warning. Silas heard it and went still, his hands signaling for Eliza to get inside. He had seen them from the ridge an hour earlier, 3 riders, moving with the arrogant confidence of hired guns. At their lead was a man in a fine coat, his face a mask of cruel entitlement. Bartholomew Thorn. Silas grabbed his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a cold, clear rage. He had run from the world to escape this very brand of predatory evil, and it had followed him to his doorstep. There would be no more running. Eliza was inside, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched through a crack in the shutter as the riders entered the clearing. She saw Thorn, and a wave of nausea and terror washed over her. He looked like a blight upon the landscape, his expensive clothes and smug expression a violation of the pure mountain air. But then she looked at the rifle she held in her hands, its wooden stock smooth and solid. She remembered Silas's patient instruction, his quiet belief in her. The terror began to recede, replaced by a hard, defiant anger. He would not take this from her. He would not take him from her. "Eliza!" Thorn's voice boomed across the clearing, slick with false charm. "Come out, my dear. This foolishness has gone on long enough. Come back to where you belong." Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. "She belongs here," he said, his voice calm and carrying. Thorn's eyes narrowed, dismissing Silas as a mere obstacle. "I have no quarrel with you, mountain man. Give me my property, and I'll even toss you a few coins for your trouble." "She's not property," Silas stated, raising the rifle to his shoulder. The 2 hired guns flanking Thorn reached for their pistols, but Silas was faster. A single shot rang out, and the hat was blasted from one of the gunmen's heads. It was a warning shot, but a clear one. A second shot would not be for a hat. The fight exploded. The hired guns dove for cover, returning fire, the bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin. Silas was a shadow, moving between the porch and the corner of the house, his shots precise and deadly. He wounded one of the men, who cried out and crawled behind a rock. But the other was smarter, circling around to flank the cabin. Thorn stayed back, a coward using others to fight his battles. Inside, Eliza saw the second gunman creeping through the trees toward the cabin's blind side. Silas was pinned down, unaware of the new threat. Her breath hitched. This was it, the moment of truth. The woman chained to a tree would have cowered and prayed. The woman standing in the cabin took aim. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was steel. She steadied the heavy rifle barrel on the edge of the window frame, just as Silas had shown her. She remembered his words, "Breathe out and squeeze. Don't pull." She put the gunman in her sights, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's kick was a brutal shove, but the shot was true. The gunman cried out and fell, clutching a leg that was no longer his own. Silas whipped his head around, his eyes locking with hers through the window, a look of shock and fierce pride on his face. She had just saved his life. The balance of the fight had shifted. She was no longer a damsel in distress. She was a soldier in this war, fighting for her home, her freedom, and her love. With both his hired men out of commission, Bartholomew Thorne was left exposed. His arrogance, however, was a shield that had never failed him before. He drew his own pistol, a fancy, silver-inlaid weapon that was more for show than for use, and strode toward the cabin. "You cannot win, you filthy peasant," he snarled at Silas, his composure cracking. "She is mine. The law says she is mine." Silas didn't answer with words. He stepped out from cover, his own rifle now empty, and faced Thorne with nothing but the cold fury in his eyes. He began to walk forward, a deliberate, menacing advance. This would not be settled with bullets. This was a matter of a more primal justice. Thorne, seeing the unarmed man approaching, smirked. He raised his pistol, confident in his victory. But as Silas closed the distance, Thorne saw something in his eyes that made his blood run cold. It was not the fear of a common man. It was the dead, hollow emptiness of a soldier who had seen hell and was not afraid to visit it again. The look unnerved him, and his first shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Silas's feet. Before he could fire a second time, Silas lunged. He moved with a speed and ferocity that belied his size, a grizzly bear roused to fury. He crashed into Thorne, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. The pistol flew from Thorne's grasp. Thorne was a man used to power, but it was the power of money and influence, not of sinew and bone. He was no match for Silas's raw strength, a strength forged by war and hardened by years of solitary labor. Silas's hands found Thorne's throat, his thumbs pressing down on the man's windpipe. Thorne's face turned from red to purple, his eyes bulging with terror as he clawed uselessly at Silas's iron grip. "She is not yours," Silas grunted, each word a hammer blow. It was then that Eliza ran from the cabin. She saw the primal violence, the murderous rage in Silas's face, and she knew in that moment that if she did not intervene, he would cross a line from which he could never return. He would kill Thorne not for justice but for vengeance, and it would poison the good man he was. "Silas, no!" she screamed, her voice cut through his rage. He looked up at her, his eyes wild. He saw her face, her beautiful, strong face, and he saw the fear in it. Not fear of Thorne, but fear for him, for his soul. He loosened his grip. Thorne gasped, sputtering for air, a pathetic, broken man. Silas stood, pulling the whimpering landowner to his feet. He dragged him over to one of the horses, tied his hands securely, and then did the same for the two wounded gunmen. The threat was over. The battle was won. Not with a final, fatal shot, but with a moment of mercy, a choice to be better than the man they had defeated. The clearing was silent, save for the moans of the wounded men and the gentle sigh of the wind through the pines. Silas and Eliza stood in the doorway of their cabin, bruised and exhausted, but together. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Their home had been violated, their peace shattered, but they had faced the ghosts of their past and had emerged victorious. They had not just survived. They had saved each other. He had saved her from the chain, and she had saved him from the darkness. They were finally, truly free. 1 year later, the spring returned to the mountain, but this time it was not a promise of hope, but a fulfillment of it. The cabin was no longer a fortress, but a home, its door and windows open to the warm, fragrant air. The neat rows of Eliza's garden had expanded, a riot of green and color that threatened to overtake the clearing. A small, sturdy barn stood where the gunfight had taken place, and the gentle lowing of a milk cow could be heard from within. The scar on the land had healed, just as the scars on their hearts had begun to fade, replaced by the beautiful, intricate patterns of a life being built together. Inside the cabin, the space was brighter, softer. Curtains, sewn by Eliza's hand, framed the window. A small collection of books had grown on the shelf. A child's rocking horse, carved by Silas during the long winter nights, sat in the corner, a silent testament to a future they were eagerly awaiting. Eliza stood on the porch, a gentle swell to her belly beneath her simple cotton dress. She was watching Silas, who was in the newly cleared field, teaching two young boys from a settlement down in the valley how to properly plant corn. After they had delivered Thorne and his men to the nearest marshal, their story had become a quiet legend in the territory. Silas was no longer seen as a fearsome hermit, but as a man of honor. And Eliza, the woman they called the Wild Rose of the Mountain, was respected for her courage. They had asked her to be the teacher for the settlement's children, and twice a week, she would hold classes on her porch, her voice a gentle, steady presence in the lives of children who had known only hardship. Silas looked up from his work and saw her watching. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward her, his long strides full of a purpose and contentment she had never seen in him that first day. He came and stood beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, his hand coming to rest on the gentle curve of her stomach. "He's kicking," she said, her voice filled with a soft, wondrous laughter. "He's got his mother's spirit," Silas replied, his voice a low, happy rumble. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in colors of rose and gold. They had found each other in the depths of despair, two broken pieces of a world that had discarded them. But here, on this mountain, they had taken those broken pieces and built something whole, something beautiful, something stronger than anything that had tried to break them. They had built a family. What chains are you carrying today? Are they chains of fear, of a painful past, or of a future that seems uncertain? The story of Eliza and Silas reminds us that even the heaviest chains can be broken. Sometimes the key is not an act of great violence, but one of small, persistent kindness. It is the courage to trust when you have been betrayed, the strength to stand when you have been knocked down, and the grace to offer a hand to someone lost in the same darkness you once knew. True freedom isn't the absence of walls, but the presence of a safe place to call home, and a hand to hold while you build it. Thank you for joining us for this story. If their journey inspired you, please let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, redemption, and the enduring power of the human heart.